Really matters.
Hello, and welcome back to Habits of a Whole Heart. I'm your host, Arnie Herz, and I'm here with my guest and friend, Rob Resnick, for part 2 of our conversation. Rob, during part 1 of our conversation, we covered numerous topics, and you referred to my book, Habits of a Whole Heart, and the upcoming book. It's not out yet. And there's 12 habits that I've outlined in my manuscript. And you, in the car ride over, noticed a number of them, and a couple of them jumped out at you.
Yeah.
So let's spend this session talking about the habits and what they are, and exploring some of these habits and showing how relevant they are in our lives.
Okay, that's great. One of the ones that really jumped out at me was the concept of finding the best in others. And I think that it's extremely easy to criticize other people. It's easier to criticize other people than it is to find fault in yourself. I think that's one of the aspects of human nature. And I've been through a number of relationships in my life, and I think one of the things that I've learned is that when you get into a situation where you're finding yourself, annoyed at somebody or angry at somebody, one of the things that's been useful for me, and we can explain, what the impact of that is, but one of the things that's been useful for me, stepping back a little bit and realizing that, one, sometimes something you're angry about in someone else is something that bothers you about yourself. That's something that psychology has long talked about. And then when you start to think about that fact, in addition to other facts, you can realize that maybe your reaction, maybe it has as much to do with you as it does to the other person.
Well, how does that help with wholeness?
Yeah. So the idea is, instead of focusing then on this negative thing about somebody, to focus on what's positive about them. And you can find that, again, it's an easier thing to find the flaws in someone else than it is, the flaws in yourself. It's similar.
Yeah, but why is that? That's true, right? It's easier to see the flaws in somebody else than yourself.
Yeah.
But in the book, Habits of a Whole Heart, why do you think that that's a habit that's worthy of, other than fairness, right? Like there's something implied in what you're saying is about fairness. It's like, it's not fair that we should judge everything favorably.
Right.
And equally. Like, so if I'm going to judge you on the same standard, I should judge you in the same standard as I judge myself. Because if I'm judging myself with a double standard, with an easier standard, it's not fair.
Right. So, I think the answer is that when you treat somebody with that kind of respect and love, appreciating their positive aspects as opposed to focusing on the negative, I think that enhances the relationship. It enhances your connectedness to the other person. And as we talked about in the first episode, this is something that I think is one of the goals, is connectedness.
And do you have any examples of that where you started judging someone negatively and then you were able to step back and change your perspective?
That's funny that you mentioned that. So one of my best friends from college is this guy, Andy Newcomb, and he lives in Bayside, and he has this friend, Jeff, who's just the most annoying person that I ever met, and he would dominate every conversation, and it turns out he has ADHD, which is why. But, I just was so annoyed by him. And then once I got him alone and had a conversation with him and realized, he's really one of the nicest people I ever met. He just is so positive, and he likes you, and he talks about, what's interesting to you. And so I went from really disliking this guy to suddenly finding like he's one of my friends now. I just adore this guy. He's phenomenal.
Beautiful. My theory is that the experience of wholeness is the natural state of affairs. The feeling of separation is artificial. So when we see the worst in someone we're negative with someone or in conflict with someone, it creates that separation because the conflict by nature, we don't feel whole.
Yeah.
So that's why we want to resolve that conflict. As a lawyer and mediator for the past 35 years, no matter how difficult the dispute, when it's resolved, there's a relief that both parties have. And they're able to settle into, I can move on with my life. So the habit of seeing the best in others is not only a way to resolve conflict and create harmony, it's also a way to move through life. I've seen my own self evolving over time is that as you move through life, we naturally see what the person's doing that's not right. We see what's also right, but we'll often focus more on what's wrong because we see the danger more than the opportunity.
Right.
And so we go through life cynical, annoyed, irritated, and this does not create a sense of wholeness within ourselves. So all these habits, by the way, go against the grain of what we would call a lower self. It goes against the grain. All of these things moves against the gravity that draws us down to a higher perspective and a higher reality.
It's very good. I like that.
I had an experience of this recently.
Yes.
I was flying back from Florida and I purposely got a seat towards the front of the plane and for my carry-on bags. And as I was boarding the plane, the flight attendant or the person who was at the gate attendant said I couldn't bring the bag on. And at first I got annoyed, and then I immediately took a step back and said, this person's just doing their job. Yeah. It has nothing to do with you. They've got a difficult job. They're trying to make the plane safe, trying to make everything go smoothly, and I just let it go. And they checked my bag at the gate. I got to the other end. My bag was the first one out at baggage claim. And I've retrained myself to not let the petty stuff bother me by seeing the best in others.
That's very good. Yeah.
So what's another habit that jumps out at you?
I was just looking at your sheet here. So the whole idea about victimhood, so I know we spoke about this a little bit, but I think it's a tendency for us to feel victimized when something bad happens, and to be angry at the world, and sometimes you're angry at God. You say, well, why is this happening? And a victim mindset is a very narrow place to be, and it doesn't allow you to step outside and see what positive things might actually be involved in what's going on. And I know when I was younger, I know that I definitely had a victim mindset about a lot of things. I mentioned some of the challenges I had when I was young. When I was in my 30s and I was just starting out, it was very difficult for me, and I ended up losing a job when I was, I just got actually.
So Rob, let me pause you for a second. So what is victimhood?
So I guess
in your perspective,
I guess it's feeling like, oh wow, poor me. If you're feeling sorry for yourself, you're feeling like the world is ganging up on you. As opposed to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, which is having a different perspective on things that happen that are like that.
So I think that with the victimhood, one of the things that I'm focusing in here is powerlessness and power.
Yeah.
Right? Of course, a victim, you feel sorry for yourself, you feel down. But at the end of the day, what is at the core of it is that you have lost power in the situation.
Right.
And you feel there's very little you can do about it. And that's what I think is so important about this particular habit of we do have terrible things happen in our lives. Everyone has had very difficult challenges. There's not a single person on this planet that hasn't had some challenge with a relationship, with health, with massive disappointment, with finances, some arena where something happens to us where we have a loss. That's real.
Yeah.
That's a reality of what's happening. The question is, what do we do with that when it happens? The victim mindset leaves us feeling powerless. So the question is, what's the right approach when we are hit with something that's real? For example, your house could be robbed. Your car could be stolen. You could be attacked physically, where you truly are the victim of a crime.
Yeah.
Or a disappointment. So that's real. We're not taking away the fact that these things happen. But when it happens, what's within our choice, or when something happens, what we're really saying is in every moment we have a choice. So what do I do with that reality once it's happened?
So I think that part of the answer is actually in one of your habits here, and it's also what's embedded in the 12-step program, which is looking at the situation and saying what things I can control and what things I can't control. And the things that you cannot control, and there are some things that you cannot control, those are things that you have to let go. And you have to be able to identify, well, what are the things that I do have control over? I think it's a slightly different issue to say, okay, well, ultimately God has control over everything. But, what the Torah says is, this doesn't mean you sit back and you just let God take care of everything. You have to do your part. You do as much as you can, and then you have to have some trust that there's a greater pattern going on. But I think it starts with this process of just knowing what you can control and what you can't. Do you have any examples of that in your life that you can share with us?
Well, I think that, I just want to go to the theory here, is that I've created this quadrant in my book manuscript of what we were talking about beforehand. We've got on the left axis, you got pain. On the right axis, you have pleasure. On the north axis that intersects, the line that intersects, you have beneficial. And then on the below is the detrimental. And I often think that something that's painful and that is initially detrimental, it's within our power to move that from the detrimental to the beneficial. That's what we can't change, whether it's painful or pleasurable. But we can change whether it's detrimental or beneficial.
And how do we do that?
That becomes the question of saying, well, what's in my control and what's outside of my control? So we often see in Israel where there's a terrorist attack and innocent lives are taken, that there's a culture that the family will undertake a project to bring about something beneficial to society that didn't exist beforehand. So we never will be able to get that life back.
Yeah.
And the tragedy of what that was is forever.
Right.
But at the same time, we can bring something into existence that didn't exist beforehand.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe we're called to do. And to transform the situation. I know in my own life and so many other people's lives, and I think that's the difference between being a victim and being empowered. We think about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
How people lost everything. They lost absolutely everything. And they went to a different country, oftentimes America, and never forgot the loss, but recreated a new life. That's what we're capable of doing. And once we understand and develop that muscle, that I am capable of taking, of being in charge of my life and bringing something beneficial out of it.
Right.
That's super empowering. And I think, as you know, one of my heroes is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, in the prime of his life, was imprisoned in Robben Island.
Yeah.
And he lost the most vibrant years of his life. And he used that time to transform himself, to be the captain of his own soul, and to never be a victim. And that self-mastery would have never happened but for the terrible injustice of his imprisonment. And we can't take away, and he couldn't take away that loss, but he was able to create something much greater. As they say, making lemonade out of lemons is not just a cliche. It's a profound muscle that we need to develop, because most people do not turn lemons into lemonade.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great story. And I have to tell you, what you're saying makes me think about is getting a positive out of one of the most horrible things that we have to experience, which is the death of a loved one. And I have to tell you, as counterintuitive as this sounds, in some ways I have gotten a lot out of the passing of some people that were close to me. My uncle, for example, who was the very religious guy, he did tefillin every morning, and he was a wonderful, warm, sweet guy, and he loved me very much. And I went to him whenever I really needed advice later in my life. He passed away, and I felt that I really absorbed at his passing and at his funeral, when they were talking about him, I really absorbed the lessons from his life. And I think people do this a lot during funerals, even with funerals that are people that they're not close to. When they hear about the person's life, you know, that's one of the things that the rabbis I know ask of you, you know, to really think about this person's life and to absorb that into your own life. So I think you can do it even in those situations.
That's beautiful. Well, I the daily class that we have every day, 8:30 to 9 on Zoom, moved from a weekly to a daily because of the passing of the brother of a good friend of ours from Chabad, where I listened to his life and I was so inspired, and he was my age and he had given so much, and I asked myself the question of what's going to happen to all that goodness. And I realized that each one of us has to bring that into the world. And so that inspired me. And I think this internalizing the essence of somebody else's life is absolutely what we should be doing. And I think that to be human, to be on a spiritual path, to be growing, to be creating that second mountaintop that you talked about in the first episode from David Brooks, requires a habit of bringing light into every situation. What does that mean, to bring light into a situation? The situation to bring light implies that there's darkness, there's some lack of light, and that's when we focus on that. Then our life is about bringing life. It's about seeing the opportunity. It's about connecting. It's about seeing what's better. And that starts changing our whole approach and starts moving us away from that which keeps us limited and separate and contracted and petty, and moves us into a larger heart and a larger reality, and where you're really making an impact, which creates a sense of wholeness and ease and comfort and beauty that we never knew was available before.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that what you're talking about, and I don't want to go too much into this, but I know that there's a book that you and I have both read, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it talks about two systems of how we think. And system one is fast and intuitive and makes snap judgments. System two is slower and takes energy and is kind of lazy. But the point is that we very often make these judgments without unconsciously without realizing it.
So Rob, I know one of your big inspirations and who you've learned a lot from is Daniel Kahneman.
Yeah.
Who was a giant in the field, won the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics, and wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which had a massive impact, not just on behavioral economics, but also in the field of psychology.
Yeah.
And in that, he talks about two systems that you often talk about, the thinking fast system and the thinking slow system.
Yeah.
And this brings to, in addition to pointing out our biases that automatically play itself out through the fast system, but there's also some benefit to the fast system. And the fast system is that of the world of habits.
Right.
So we've been talking about wholeness, but we haven't talked about habits yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the world of habits, what happens is when we first think about riding a bike, we have to think about it a lot. So we're in our slow system.
Right. Right.
But eventually it becomes second nature and it becomes habitual.
Yeah.
So one of the things that this book aims to do is to take these habits, these practices, and make them habitual. So when something negative happens, your first reaction is, I'm not going to go down a spiral, and I'm going to understand that there is a bigger picture here.
Right. And part of the mechanism of how I think this operates is I think the system one, this fast one, it's really based on the unconscious. And we don't seem to be able to directly control the unconscious, and a lot of our reactions are based on the unconscious. A lot of decisions we make, as you were pointing out, are things that, in fact, psychology often says that sometimes you make a decision unconsciously without even realizing it, and then your intellect justifies it. But the fact is that this is how it operates. And what you're talking about, the idea of doing these things on a regular basis, I believe what ends up happening is it ends up impacting your subconscious. So when you do things over time, again and again, they become part of your unconscious. And it's what you were just saying just now, which is that so suddenly your reaction, instead of being what it might have been in the past, you've now retooled your subconscious to some extent through these habits, and suddenly you have a different immediate reaction. And it also impacts your decision making. You're making better decisions.
So I think that's excellent. And you just gave me an insight as you were talking, which is that we have a subconscious, we have a conscious mind. And with everything that exists in this world, it could be used for good and it could be used for bad, and oftentimes it's used for both.
Yeah.
Almost invariably. So how do we use our mind? And how do we use the different aspects of our mind? So the subconscious, generally, for most of us, is very much filled with lower self habits, lower self belief system, lower self triggers, because we're trying to survive in this world. So we're constantly focusing in on what's wrong and what's the danger and what's the problem, because that's the way to survive.
Yep.
It's a me and you mindset. And what we're saying is, okay, we need to temper that and add in a whole element of unconscious that reflects our higher self, that when there's something that happens, there's something positive about it. When we're in a conflict with someone, to try to see the best, to, instead of focusing on what I need, to be asking, where am I needed? All of these things start retraining us. So the basic way we start showing up in the world is with the higher self. And I think this is one of the importance. It's retraining the subconscious and filling it with habits that are much more beneficial for our wholeness, for our experience, an integrated life that integrates a lower self with the higher self, the me with the universe, and this moment in time with that which is eternal. And I think that has been very helpful to think that through. So Rob, we're going to be closing up now. In the two sessions that we've had, in a few words, what are your key takeouts that you think will impact you as you're leaving here, that you learned that you didn't have when you first came in?
I think really the big one has to do with what you're just talking about just now, which is really just beginning to retrain the subconscious. I hadn't actually thought about it in that kind of way, as retraining it, but I think that's something that, through daily habits will end up, having a downstream impact on me and then help me be as much of a light to the world as I can be.
Beautiful. And for me, it's that. And also the seeing the best in others, of understanding how when we find faults in others, it creates separation and it impacts our own soul, and it prohibits us or inhibits us from being able to experience connection with others. And it's something very much to keep in mind. So, Rob, thank you for being my guest.
Okay.
Thank you, the listeners, for listening in once again on this podcast called Habits of a Whole Heart, which you can find on HMTV. Thank you for subscribing, for following up, and there will be many more episodes as we delve into these topics in the process of helping refine my book manuscript and the ideas that will hopefully have an impact on society and bring light into this world. So have a lovely day. Thank you very much.